Well, to discuss more on the life and death of the extraordinary man that is Fidel Castro, I'm now joined by Sreeram Chaulia, Professor and Dean of Jindal School of International Affairs. Thank you for joining me, sir. Now, Fidel Castro, he was very cautious about the renewal of ties with the US, wasn't he? What now?
I think he had the last laugh. If you see, from Kennedy to Obama, he outlived many presidents who tried to overthrow him. And eventually, Obama initiated a big thaw for relaxation of the many of the restrictive regimes and practices that the United States had imposed. The trade embargo indeed has not yet been removed, but that requires US congressional intervention. But I think inch by inch, as he grew older, Fidel, as the grand old man, the revolutionary of Latin America, ultimately succeeded in chipping away at the American restrictions. So I think now the question remains how the Trump administration will take it forward. But to a great extent, at the grand old age, 90 plus, he would have been satisfied that ultimately he was proven right that this policy towards trying to isolate Cuba had failed on the part of the United States, and Cuba survived, Cuba thrived, and Cuba built relations with the rest of the world, and ultimately showed how unjust and unfair the American empire, as Fidel used to call it, was.
Do you think it's likely that the death of Castro, along with Trump's new presidency, will spell a change in the future course of relations?
I think the generation has changed. A lot of the opponents of the Castros who were exiled in the United States, especially in Florida, have given way to younger Cuban Americans who are much more pragmatic and who believe that Cuba is central to for the United States to rebuild its image, which had been badly bruised. To rebuild in a positive direction by embracing Cuba. So I don't know if the Trump administration will try and reverse the momentum. It does look like there are some elements in the Republican Party who oppose reconciliation with Cuba, but the ground sentiment in Latin America is totally in favor of reintegrating Cuba. And in fact, it's the United States that had been isolated by the rest of Latin America because of its obstinate opposition to accepting Cuba as a legitimate and just member of the Committee of Nations in the Western Hemisphere.
Now, in recent times, we've seen a rise of anti-establishment figures all around the world. And in the US, for example, Bernie Sanders, he inspired a lot of people with his socialist agenda. Do you think Castro is still a source of inspiration for this new generation of socialists?
Castro was a very special figure. He was the greatest revolutionary of the 20th century. And he combined not just military kind of revolutionary activity or like an insurrection to overthrow feudal regimes, but also intellectual thought about resistance and anti-imperialism. So I think Castro will be forever etched in people's minds, especially anyone who believes that they need to come together to struggle for justice and peace. So I think Castro, no matter what his ideological leanings were, whether you're from right or left or even center or socialist or whatever label you want to give it, Castro is the ultimate kind of hero figure. And because he fought against the odds, the underdog, and survived, I think Castro's legacy is that we should not take unjust structures for given and granted and say that nothing can be done about it. His whole life was action as well as intellectual activity to break down oppressive regimes and structures and institutions. So as long as there is unfairness in this world, there will be a kind of a Castro effect, Castro legacy that will continue to shine and create momentum from below for change, historical change in societies.
Now, Fidel Castro, it seems he was like the last open skeptic of rapprochement between the US and Cuba. With that in mind, what does his death mean for the future of Latin America?
I think the left has actually succeeded in Latin America for the last 10 to 15 years. Hugo Chavez of Venezuela was a disciple of Castro. But now the left may be reaching a kind of a saturation point. In Argentina, they have been defeated. In Brazil, they've been defeated. So it's possible, even in Venezuela, the left may be defeated. So, these things happen in cycles. But the message of Castro remains in the sense that, wherever there is exploitation, be it in the international system or in your domestic society, you must rise up. So I think that message remains, no matter whether it is left, right, or center. People of various persuasions will find that when they want to mobilize for a cause, when they want to, galvanize the society or a whole nation or a region against imperialism, Castro is the gold standard because he lived a complete life based on these principles with no double standards. He spoke the truth, and for all the criticism that he was oppressive, the fact is you cannot sustain a regime like this purely based on propaganda and lies. There was legitimacy to the Cuban system. Their social welfare system has been superior to some of the Western models. And at the end of the day, I do agree that Cuba could have done better economically, but the point is, under the kind of pressure and the shadow of American empire, I think this was the best they could do to somehow eke out an honorable and dignified existence. And that's what Castro stands for in Latin America and for the world. He's a symbol for living a dignified life and to fight for it.
Now, to many people, Fidel Castro was the symbol of opposition to US dominance. What kind of significance do you think his death will have to countries opposing the US?
Well, they will continue to go by his spirit. And wherever, if the US attempts to impose neo-colonial forms of domination, people will invoke Grandpa Fidel, because he became an elder figure around the world, as I said, for anti-establishment structures. So eventually, Fidel is like he's like an angelic figure now. He has entered the realm of a kind of like a sainthood for the left or anyone who wants to be seen to be on the side of justice and peace. So I think they will find renewed energy. And as I said, the fact that towards the end of his life, even the United States had to reconcile with him. They had tried to assassinate him so many times and failed. I think this is legend, and this is more than simply fighting a revolution and overthrowing a regime. He maintained the new regime, he built the revolutionary system, and he also supported liberation struggles in Africa, across Asia, in Latin America. So I think this was like a global historical figure. There was like a world before Fidel and a world after Fidel, because that intervention, this long life of 90 years, he transformed the international order altogether and created a sense that we can actually strive for a better planet.
Now, as in life, Castro is proving to be deeply divisive in death as well. In Miami, shortly after the announcement of Fidel Castro's death, we've seen people take to the streets to celebrate that he had died, singing, dancing, waving Cuban flags. What do you make of this?
Well, I don't think they represent the majority in Miami anymore. There is a generational transformation. Most of the young Cuban Americans I have met or heard of tend to be much more open to rebuilding the broken links with Cuba. And if you see the way Cuban Americans are going back home to their motherland since Obama relaxed many of the restrictions, it clearly shows that they are not bound by the old ideological biases. We are in the 21st century, and the Cold War should have been long buried and over. So why hang on to those kind of attitudes anymore? Fidel was open to to embracing some of these people from Florida, provided they saw Cuba with open eyes. And anyone who has traveled to Cuba, who's been there, knows that it's not entirely devoid of problems. But the point is, Cuba is an example, and for Cuban Americans in Miami and Florida, it's ultimately culture and civilizationally they are linked, and we should not have done this inhuman thing of this embargo for 60 years, and it's still there. So I think in the death of Fidel Castro, people should at least try now to find reconciliation rather than to continue to play the old politics of divisiveness.
Sreeram Chaulia, Professor and Dean of Jindal School of International Affairs, thank you so much for coming on to RT International today and giving us your insight into the life and death of Fidel Castro. Thank you.